Good morning. It's so wonderful to have a microphone because when you talk loud, your whole being is different. You can't as easily tune into the heart. So having something that makes you loud when you're really soft is such a support and a delight. It's like I'm whispering to you. I want to start out with a song from the monastic community in Plum Village. And some of you may already be familiar with this, but every time I hear it, it just goes to my core. And I won't say any more about it yet, until we've heard it. It's called Little Star. And Steve and Yusef and I will get out of the way so you can see it fully. It's recorded in Plum Village. I'm not sure if it's Upper or Lower Hamlet, but if you haven't been there, you'll see it's a combination of very old and very new. And that's my introduction for this song.
I've been searching in the self for existence, all alone by myself, reminiscing underneath the Bodhi tree, but it isn't only me, you and that collective energy. How it's supposed to be, I hope to be the ocean tide, with my spirit open wide, standing on the mountaintop, see the world with open eyes. I was so surprised to know that I'm a part of this. Sunrise, sunset, rain clouds, all of it, the journey of awakening, taking it with one step, one breath, save all beings till there's none left. Suffering is painful, but I'm still the same fool, searching for the river while I'm swimming in the same pool. Maybe we can find it, keep the light shining, walking on the path of ancestors behind me. If you could be the person who you are in your heart, would you grow a little bit, or would you play a bigger part? Love is a paintbrush, life is the biggest
Just notice what is going on inside for you right now. For me, this song is our tradition. It's a poem by Thai, set in a time that was horrific for people who had been occupied by 4,000 years. And Thai was not a traditionalist. He had a deep, deep faith in Buddhism, but not the Buddhism that was contemporary for his time. So he was a renegade. He was a rule breaker. And he also had tremendous faith in the tradition as it was being renewed by him and others. He didn't start the renewal, but he sure gave it a big boost. So in this song, you see there's a tremendous amount of tradition. There's monastics who live a life of form and deep commitment. And you hear the sweetness of those rooted traditions in the poem, in the song, through the nuns. And the nuns are the ones who hold those roots. So often the women are the traditionalists. They hold the family rooted in the ground, feeding and nurturing. And the men are out there. And the men in this song are really out there. They're bringing in the contemporary music and the energy, and they're blending those roots with innovation that's speaking to the moment, speaking to younger people. And the form has been changing for 2,600 years to adapt to the moment. And so it thrills me to see that the monastics are really doing their best to hold both tradition and innovation without becoming unrooted or rigid. Now, I come from Northern California, where it's normal to be queer and innovative and rootless. That's not all bad. And we're coming to Montana, and specifically to this Sangha, which is rooted in a beautiful way, with deep wisdom going into every detail of retreat. And you have a tradition that brings tremendous comfort and safety, and sometimes can err in the direction of rigidity, or what happens when we don't have it just the way we're used to. So it challenges us to look to see which of our traditions really still serve us, and which of our traditions need some tweaking. And in the beginning of doing our embrace work, we got a lot of pushback. Fortunately, the trauma-informed became a rage in every nook and cranny of study in our culture. So we were helped out a little bit by that. But you see those three nuns, the one on the violin from Japan, and the two Vietnamese sisters singing. They've all been through this training as well, and they really wanted it to be something for every monastic, because as we see, every one of us holds trauma as our inheritance, that trauma is something that's held in the body and it's passed on generation after generation. There's a funny story that illustrates it, although it's not intended to do that. There's 3 generations of people in the kitchen at Thanksgiving, and they're making their tradition of a ham. And they go to put the ham in the oven, and the middle one, the middle generation says, no, you can't put it in yet. You have to cut the end off. And the youngest said, well, why? And the middle one didn't know why. She said, or they said, that's just how we do it. And turns to the older generation and says, why do we do this? And the older generation says, because when I started doing it, the pen was too small. But the tradition is passed on unquestioning. So we have events that happen to us as human beings. We have unwanted medical emergencies. We have natural disasters. We have death, war, poverty, racism. Our culture is really, in some ways, the cumulative rules to prevent bad things from happening that happened in the past. They become part of our culture. And also, some of the ways in which people have found resources to celebrate various holidays. And sometimes the holidays are happy ones, and sometimes they're sad ones, and sometimes they're mixed, or we don't realize they're mixed until we look deeply. So we have a culture that we pass on to our children that is the accumulation of trauma and resilience. And we really don't question that very often. Trauma is the difficult things that happen to us that our nervous system is not ready for, can't handle, and shake it off. And so it becomes imprinted. But when my grandmother escaped from genocide in Eastern Europe, she didn't have any tools to handle her feelings, and she came alone. And she came to a country where she didn't speak English, and fortunately she was met by people who spoke her language. But the fears stayed with her, and she never, ever talked about them. But she raised her children to be fearful of strangers, of knocking on the door at night, of what would happen if you got a cold. You could die from that, where my grandmother was from, and probably when my mother was born also, you could have died from that. So I got a lot of messages about health, even though the resources were completely different. I see this tremendously in the Vietnamese families that come through the monastery where small errors could have meant death for those children in Vietnam. And even though they're safe, they're still hypervigilant. The parents are very strict with those children, even though it's perhaps not still necessary. And so much trauma can be absorbed, or so much difficulty can be absorbed if it's supported. But so often we don't have the tools or the proximity to support. And that's what makes trauma go deep into the body. And when we are feeling the effects of trauma, it can be very confusing because small things can remind our implicit memory, our memories that are set in our habits, in our bones, in our reactions. It can make us do things that we know cognitively. We can even be watching and going, why am I doing this? There's no reason. But in fact, there is a reason. Because it's held in our memory, in our hippocampus, to act fast, to react fast. So just for visual sake, I'm going to ask everyone to stand up, if you're able, or raise your hand if you're not. And I don't mean to out you, I just mean as a way to get up without necessarily doing what you shouldn't do. So I want to invite you that if you have had a small t trauma, some thing that made you afraid or fearful or angry, or you were raised by somebody who gave you that message of fear or anger or grief, just sit down. Oh, wait a second. I got a lot more to go. I didn't expect that. Get up. Let's do the big T's. All right. If you were raised in a situation of poverty, please sit down. Or if your parents were raised in a situation of poverty, please sit down. If you or your parents have experienced war, please sit down. If you or your parents have experienced some kind of oppression, such as racism, please sit down. Homophobia, please sit down. Sexism, please sit down. That should take care of everybody. If you're still standing, think again. And I don't mean to belittle it, but if we think about the way greed, hatred, and delusion are individual manifestations in us all, but there's a collective manifestation in having something that's a survival go awry. So perhaps there was a time when economics as a bottom line was a real clever adaptation, but over time it's taken on a snowball effect, as is gender roles, as are perhaps identifying who's part of the tribe and safe and not, and now is morphed into racism or homophobia or whatever. That we form habits, they become traditions, we see them all around us in our culture, and then they are normal. Then they are looked at as healthy. And when people begin to chip away at those traditions, it can be very uncomfortable. It can be something as simple as, we didn't do the second sit today. How come we didn't do the second sit today? Or, oh, I just can't settle because we didn't do that. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as we can look at it and say, is this beneficial, or is this standing in my way? I would also say that, a little kayak can make all kinds of clever maneuvers in the water. But one of those luxury cruisers, they take a big radius. It's a long way to turn around. The mindfulness trainings, when I took them, I had no trouble with signing on. And about 10 or 15 years into it, they changed the third one because they found that people were not honoring the commitments that they had to their relationships. So they put in a line that you wouldn't have sexual relations without love and a long-term commitment made known to your family and friends. And I, as a queer person, got pretty uptight about that, and that every time I had to read it, I felt so torn to stay with the tradition or to speak out, because that was an oppression for people who were in beautiful, long-term, loving commitments. And so today we are continuing to chip away at those traditions that are not serving us. And we have to look really deeply at our own discomforts. And I've really gone off the path of where I was going. We have many kinds of trauma, and we're all holding them. Trauma is a normal thing for human beings because we've created a living environment that is not in keeping with our nature. And so constantly cultivating, looking deeply where we're uncomfortable, and discerning whether it's beneficial or not is primary. And that takes resourcing ourselves so we have the stamina and bravery and some faith that we can do it. And more easily doing it as a Sangha, as a collective, than individual. We have this historical trauma, generational trauma, complex trauma, more than one, cumulative trauma, too little, too long, or too much, too rocks in the rock tumbler. And we have plain old simple trauma. And they're all compounded when we don't have the emotional support, no one to co-regulate with us at the time or thereafter. So we have kind of two kinds of memory. I think that's oversimplified, but for our purposes right now, it'll be good enough. We have implicit trauma, which is trauma that's held in our senses. So we don't have a story. It doesn't have a time. It just has a trigger of fear or anger or despair. And then we have explicit memories, which go along with a story, and we're oriented in time, and we know what came first and what came after. Even if it isn't tremendously accurate, at least it feels real. But when something happens to us, there's about a 15-second collage of dysregulation that's connected to all of the senses that are being stimulated at the moment. So if the ceiling were to fall in while I was watching you be intent on looking at me, 20 years from now, if somebody gave me that look, I might be terrified because I was just looking at you when the ceiling fell in. Actually, I watched Ty once where the ceiling did fall in right next to him, and he went like this. Because Ty really cultivated, he was raised with incredible trauma all around him, but he also had a home. And he had a sense of stability and immense caring from his mother, and he hung on to that for dear life. Ty was not miraculous. He had a determination to overcome some incredible traumas, and he didn't always succeed in overcoming them. He had some very significant bouts of depression. He had insomnia, but he had the wisdom and the determination to develop a Sangha that supported him, and practices that he developed that were things that worked on his body to overcome his traumatic responses. And so that's where our tradition comes from. It comes from somebody who was practicing with trauma and wanted to see what was practical. And then he taught it to many people, and many people taught it to each other. And that's what we're doing. So if you find yourself bewildered by your emotional state that seems to change all of a sudden, when you have the stability, be curious about what that was about. But also know that you don't need to know what it was about to regulate your nervous system and to practice well. And there are some practitioners, when you first come to practice, you may be offered a variety of practices, and some of them you really like, and some of them you don't really like. Generally, what I found was I gravitated to the practices that were easiest for me, that I already had a little bit of facility in doing them. I did not gravitate to breathing at all. And eventually I realized that as a little girl, I did not like being isolated, and I had to go to bed early. And everybody else congregated in the living room to do fun stuff. And it was lonely to a large degree, not only because I didn't get to go in the living room, but because my parents couldn't share deeply because they didn't learn how to go inside because my grandmother couldn't go there. So as a third level trauma survivor, when I got into bed at night, I felt anxious and alone, and my breathing wasn't very fun to watch. And so when I started watching it, I would just become more anxious. I just couldn't quite catch my breath. And then eventually, I felt like I was an imposter to a practitioner. So I gravitated to the mindfulness trainings, and I had it down. I was thinking about the mindfulness trainings with every action, but I started to get judgmental. Maybe I was already judgmental, but I really started seeing it. Because I started out, if this is a curve of practice where deep looking is being learned, and here you can really deep look. Over here, there's a downside. To every practice, if you do it too much, there can be a downside. If you get one-pointed concentration down, I can just groove on one-pointed, you can become very rigid. Or you can become dissociated from your body because you just, this is all you are. So when we already gravitating to what we do best, there's a risk of going over the edge. If you're not a great practitioner, if you're not practicing several hours a day, you're probably protected. And I can remember when Ty was saying, although I don't know that Ty did it himself, after 25 minutes, that's enough. And it used to be at the monastery, they would sit for 25 minutes. Now they sit for 45. But nevertheless, to know that for a small percentage of people, mindfulness practice can actually have some pitfalls. It's a small percentage, but it's important to know out of this many people, there may be one person who sits and kind of gets dissociated from their body, or they may get so removed that they don't have much in the way of emotion, or they feel so compassionate that they can't stand to see suffering of any sort, and they have to run away. So those are some pitfalls. Also, we have a pitfall in our practice of what might be called spiritual bypassing. That means that you're using a spiritual idea to run away from a developmental task that all humans need. So, for instance, to see a person doing something that is harmful, but to say, oh, that doesn't bother me. I don't get upset with that, when really they're at a loss for how to confront it in a way that's kind. Or not speaking up because we want to have right speech, because we don't have the tools, right? So these are some of the tools. And by the way, You know, if I can't think of something, I just try not to get uptight about it and ask somebody else. Because we don't have to have it all together. We have a Sangha, that's what we're for, you know? At Brown University, they have a tremendously active mindfulness center. It happens to be run by an OI. And a number of years ago, one of the researchers, a mindfulness researcher there, was doing research on sleep and found that actually the more you meditate, the worse your sleep. It's another pitfall of dedicated meditators. I doubt that's why I don't sleep.
If you've ever read Old Path, White Clouds, there are lots and lots of portions where the narrative says something along the lines of the Buddha and his bhikkhus did not sleep very much that night, but they were still rested.
But I can tell you, the long story is that eventually Brown University created something called Cheetah House, and I have this on a handout, so you don't have to write it down, where they took former monastics who were going to university, and disrobed monastics coming back from the East, and they housed them as a transition because they were having difficulties, and the Cheetah House got so full they had to abandon it and put it online for people who were having adverse effects from meditation. And now Cheetah House gets something like 2,000 new hits a month. Because half of the people in the United States are playing around with meditation outside of a Sangha, no teacher, no mentor, perhaps from a book, or even worse, from an app that tells them to do something that's actually not within their capacity. So just to be aware that those things happen, and they're fairly rare. But as we become more aware, we can do practices that balance it out. So for instance, if you're doing a concentration practice and you're feeling removed, you do a metta practice, a loving kindness practice that brings you back, or you do something that brings you back into your body, so that when you sit, you're balancing your needs all the time. And it's wonderful to have a mentor. You don't have to be an OI to have a mentor. You can talk to your Sangha facilitator about who could I get for a mentor. Dharma teachers need mentors as well. Just because you're a seasoned practitioner doesn't mean that you couldn't fall into one of those little pitfalls. But I don't want to belabor it, because it isn't the basic practice, and that the practice isn't a panacea. And these practices that we're learning are to help you overcome difficulties in your practice, in the way you embody the teachings in your life. But they're not a substitute for somebody who's really skilled at holding space for you, at being able to co-regulate with you as you work through some of the really deep things that need that one-on-one re-relationshiping for whatever it is that you've suffered. And that doesn't mean we all need to be in therapy, but it also doesn't mean that some of us at times could really benefit from a skilled practitioner of your choice, there are many kinds of healers that do this work, because we're all sitting with the same nervous system. So what works on our nervous system, people see through different lenses. This lens right now, we're talking about neuroscience, but there's all kinds of others. So we're going to do a little experiment for those of you who choose to do the experiment. I'm going to introduce you to some quick and easy regulating tools, because the tools of breathing and noticing subtleties in the body, of bringing to mind well-being, those all take a modicum of regulation to access. If I'm freaking out about something and somebody says, well, just bring a sense of well-being. It's like, I don't want that. I want to be where I am, whatever it is. So how do we bring ourselves down enough to then access some of those nice tools? So around the room, I have some pictures or some invitations to try something out. There's one of drinking something and really noticing, right on that pillar, right above you, And then over there is like, okay, I just need to notice shapes. Oh, there's a triangle, there's a triangle. If I put a line over there, there's a triangle. Those are very simple ideas that one can grasp, or one can give to somebody else to say, if I'm freaking out, do this. So over there is behind Anne, is wrapping up in some blanket or shawl, or pulling your jacket tight, or having some heavy object on you, or even having somebody sit on you. Surprisingly can be very, very regulating. That one is doing something with your mind, like counting backwards by 3s from 100, or if you're mathematically challenged, counting back by 1s from 20. I can't see what that one says. Can you tell us?
If you're inside or outside, notice the furniture, tree, wall, a surface.
Yeah.
Touch the surface, noticing if it's hard, soft, rough.
So textures, touching things, looking at colors, trying to identify, okay, where is bright orange? I noticed that's awful, wow. More, yeah. So it brings us down. Spelling your name backwards. What's that one? Sounds. So there's one over there. And so you just don't lean, you kind of like sit as if you're in a chair with no chair. And there should be one of pushing. Oh, it's behind the screen. Okay, we should put the screen up. So that one is moving the wall just 1/4 of an inch. So you're pressing against the wall as hard as you can, of course, without hurting yourself, because the wall is very strong, and you probably won't succeed. But we're going to start with a little meditation to prime the pump. So here are the instructions. And I want you to follow them to a T. The instruction is to keep your feet flat on the floor with this one. No, not literally. In the pool. I'm going to invite you to bring up something that's annoying, but is not something you think is going to take you down a rabbit hole, for sure, all right? It could be how your roommate doesn't shut the door completely, or leaves food on the plate when they wash it, or something like that. Something big enough so you can feel the effects of it in your body, or like, nah. And just get a sense of that. Because I'm going to ask you that in every station as you go around the room, you hold that annoyance as you do the activity. Just keep bringing up the annoyance over and over and over again as you go through each station. And to ask yourself, how is this activity in front of me affecting me inside as I think of my issue? And you're picking one that's small enough so you're pretty sure you're not going to go down any rabbit holes. And the smaller your capacity that you discern, the smaller the thing I want you to pick. And if you feel like you have no capacity for doing it, don't. Just take how you are in this minute and do the activity. We're going to have like 10 minutes to do all 10. So we do it in silence. You don't have to be standing in front of the thing to do it. You can just see what it is. And when you're finished, you can sit back down. And if you want to put a little note on the card of what was effective for you and what was not, that's great. But just to know that every different issue might have a different little activity that would be helpful for it. So it isn't like, oh, colors always works for me. Sometimes I need to take a drink or wrap up. Okay? Questions?
Yeah, what's the rectangle with the yellow letter?
The rectangle with the yellow are people with whom you can share or things that you know regulate you. Like, for instance, maybe hand lotion is something you do, or brushing your hair is something you do to regulate yourself when nothing else works, or playing music or singing a song or petting your dog. Then you put it in that little, because we all have these things that we know already. This is just embellishing our repertoire. And thank you for that, because that was an important point. And then you see the two little figures with their arms around each other, and the 3 lines above that are people with whom you'd like to share this card so that they can help you come down when you need it. Yes?
So, do you see these as being different, these activities as being different from an activity you do for self-soothing, or is that what we're...
You try that. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. They're self-soothing and they're simple. So we can use them in a pinch when we can't use those other tools that we've talked about. So at the sound of the little bell, you can get to it. There'll be a bell after 5 minutes and one at 10 minutes. And let's make sure we stay silent. But I want you to check in with yourself now and just bring up the difficulty and notice what it's like compared to when you started. And what are you noticing? Does it feel the same or different than when you started doing all these little things?
That was a sound, and I did the inside-outside sounds. It's just more a part of the environment instead of an annoyance.
The difficulty is a part of the, oh, I see. The annoyance was sound, and now it's just a part of the environment. Great, thanks. Yeah, Greg?
When I bring the story of the charge behind it is gone.
Gone?
So that, yeah, not completely, but it's just a little buzzing instead of
Great. Eva?
I sort of forgot about it. So instead it was around.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know if that's part of the solution.
Well, when you think about, you don't know what it is anymore?
I know what it is, I just.
So now when you think about whatever it was, what do you notice?
It's less than, yeah.
For how many of you was that true to some extent? Look around. So this is the key to how to do bigger stuff. That what we do, I call it roasting a marshmallow. You know, if you stick a marshmallow on a stick, and you stick it right in the flame, what you have is a charcoal mess that you couldn't possibly enjoy. But if you know where to put it in the flame, and you watch and see if it's browning a little bit, then you take it out of the flame into wellness, into well-being, and then maybe you turn it and put it back into the flame in just a little while, and when you notice it's enough, you pull it out, and you keep doing that, and the inside melts, and the outside becomes very resilient. And that's what we do with bigger difficulties. First, we know our capacity. And you can tell your capacity because when you put that marshmallow into the flame and it's getting dark fast, you get it out and maybe you don't have s'mores that day. Maybe you just have tea and a cookie. So I want to have that opportunity for us to try that out if you feel you have the capacity. And if you do not, just take this time as a meditation on some resource or well-being or whatever helps you regulate, even if it's standing up and doing a little walking or wrapping in a blanket or humming a tune in your mind. So I invite you to bring up your resource first. We always, that's the graham crackers on the either side of the s'more. You have a resource to start with and a resource to finish. So we get a felt sense of that in our bodies. We just sit with whatever it takes to bring up a sense of well-being, whether it's in our body or in our mind. It will begin to manifest in sensations in our body that we can hold with our hand or whatever makes you have that palpable sense, an embodied sense of well-being.
I recently had someone call me from far away, just so
Sweet. That's an embodied sense. So we're going to do that in our meditation now. We'll go back to an embodied sense, and you might even hold yourself as a baby. Creativity is foremost here, tailoring it to you. And when you have that sense, to invite up a difficulty that's difficult enough to really feel it in your body, but not so difficult that you think you will go down some rabbit hole. So something where you still have your tippy toes on the bottom of the pool. And if you should choose wrong, you'll just get an opportunity to use some of the tools. Just staying with the sense of well-being when you need it. So you begin by bringing up a difficulty and just noticing where you feel it in your body. You don't need to do anything more than that. And once it starts to surface and you feel it, and you go, yeah, that's this. Then go back out of the fire into your sense of well-being. We're going to go into the fire through the 5 skandhas, or through some of them. And we start with the body, just noticing where does this issue surface in our bodies. Not trying to change it. When you've had enough, then you go back to the well-being. And maybe you do that once and that's it. Or you might visit there a couple of times to know those sensations in a little more detail. To visit it a little bit longer. Maybe 4 seconds now and 6 seconds the next time. Just taking little bits, going back and forth. Well-being, ill-being. And then maybe you also, when you go back into the fire, notice what you're telling yourself. And then go back into the well-being when you've had enough. Honoring your own capacity and stretching. Maybe you add in some image you have of this difficulty, the picture you hold in your mind. Notice it. Maybe there are more details there than you thought. And when you sense your limit, go back to the well-being. If you begin to feel caught, you can open your eyes feel the grounding. Notice the story. Is it true? Are you sure? And then going back to the well-being, the second graham cracker. You can go back for some more later. So as we did with the going around the room exercises, just notice now when you bring that difficulty to mind, whether there's any change. What was that like for you? Peggy?
Joanne, I just want to comment that I had difficulty bringing a bodily feeling up. I could bring the image of my annoyance, but not the bodily feeling. So what I notice is that that bodily feeling comes up unwanting. I can feel it when it's triggered, but to bring the image up, I can feel the grounding images in my body, but I'm having difficulty bringing up the image of a mild annoyance when feeling it anywhere. So then the rest of the exercise was just kind of going back and forth.
Got it.
Without.
Sometimes in fear of getting something too big, it's too little to work. And so you might want to try it again with something more substantial.
Or maybe it was too big and I didn't want to feel it.
Maybe. That can happen. And sometimes that's a real plus for the kinds of workshops that we're doing, of spending time instead of thinking like, okay, I'm going to sit on the cushion and make it come up, is to write about it in detail, and something happens in that writing, and then there it is. And then during the writing, you would go back to that sense of well-being if it gets overwhelming, and going back and forth. Or, going out into the woods and telling your story to a tree. And there it is, as you're telling the story, or as you're moving, or some piece of music, or the art, and you're holding this story along with something that gives you a sense of well-being, of joy, of safety, so that it doesn't need to be just on the cushion, that our practice can be funneled through expressive arts just as well. And that's really important. Tai did not just funnel his stuff through sitting. He wrote poetry. He wrote articles. He had song. There were a lot of, Call Me By My True Name, song. Those are things that bring us a sense of comfort and safety, and we're working at the same time. So thank you for that. Yes?
I guess
often use mantras or affirmations, and that's been something that's been helpful for me.
For a sense of well-being. Terrific. Yeah. So what did you notice in doing this activity? Did it make any difference in what was curious about it? Yeah.
And at the very end, when you said bring the story back up,
Uh-huh.
I know I had just like a very simple one-sentence narrative that was different that went with it.
Uh-huh. And then what? How was that for you?
Just like kind of a normalizing narrative.
Uh-huh.
You know, just making sense of it in a like, oh, this happens kind of way.
Right. So the charge was less.
Yeah. Just
And that's important because the stories are real and we don't need to change what happened to us. You know, we honor what happened, but if we can be less reactive, then we can make wiser choices in how we relate to that story. Any other comment about the exercise? Yeah, John?
I noticed that I had a tendency, when I brought it up, it was like a recognition that it bothered me. It was almost like, oh, that actually bothered me. Without the exercise, I think I kind of was pushing it aside.
Great. That's kind of the opposite, but also beneficial. Is that if you're not in touch with it, so that's one step closer to, that is part of the working with it, is to, oh yeah, it did bother me. Yeah.
I probably picked something too big because after a couple minutes, I just had to open my eyes and was kind of spin.
Uh-huh.
And kind of went into the shadow, which is the
Uh-huh.
reaction that triggered. So, but I can see that by resourcing it and then playing with that, maybe shorter time periods, or expressive parts. But I thought it's probably also good to have the example of it being too much.
Yes. And in the future, before you bring that up again, you might want to explore just what is shutting down and take that little piece at a time so that the shutting down doesn't feel so scary or difficult. So, that's different pieces. And take the smallest pieces first. And also, you don't have to on purpose bring something up. Life will let us have that for free. And you can work on really plumping up those wholesome seeds and then remembering what you do when you plump up the wholesome seeds, you do it again when those feelings come up in your life. So that's knowing your capacity, and it sounds like you got clear, maybe not quite as fast as you might want to get clear, but you opened your eyes, and shutting down is our natural protection. Your body is wise. It said, okay, this is too much, we're going to give it much less. So then you learn to work with that. Yeah.
There's a part that has a hard time letting it go and coming back to the resourcing and the safety, and it says that I have to figure this out, otherwise it's going to keep happening, and like an underlying story of I'm not safe if I just rest, and I wonder how you suggest working with that part.
Maybe you have a little conversation about pacing, that you're wanting to go the whole distance. And so you need to pace yourself rather than burn yourself out and do it too fast. That's good to know about yourself. And that takes some discipline to not go there so quickly. So, don't know if, saw you shaking your head. Do you have, which his sentiment? You want to say some things about how you've worked with it? Or not? Okay. Later. Is that okay? Good, thanks. In the interest of time, because we're already quite late, I want to say just a couple of things. One is about sharing your story. We try to share our story in the least stimulating way possible. That we don't want to re-traumatize ourselves in order to have accompaniment. It's very common for us to have felt very alone in our story. And one way to not feel alone is to tell it in every detail possible. And it actually doesn't work well for you because it's like reliving it. Your body does not know that it's not happening again. And chances are the person who's listening doesn't want to hear it in that detail because they're co-regulating with you and they don't want to go there either. So finding a way to tell your story and to trust that the person listening can get enough out of what you experienced to be compassionate. And sometimes that's the beauty of being in a group that is an affinity group, whether it's a Sangha affinity group, a person of color group, an LGBTQ group, Overeaters Anonymous, AA, is that those people already know. They don't have to hear the details. And that can be very healing to be with people who know where you've been at, so you don't have to revisit it in order to feel heard, seen, and cared about. So we have some handouts. Patty and Lori, this is your time. They've tried to hand these out twice before. It hasn't been the right time. These are little handouts from our Embrace website, and they have some resources on them for you. The consultation groups today after lunch, the little group ones downstairs, if you want to join it and there's no slots, you're welcome to come and listen. Taking the mindfulness trainings in the ceremony tomorrow, just to know you can take 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. That's up to you. It's often really interesting to just try one, to commit yourself publicly and to see where it takes you, because sneaky as it is with the interbeing nature of everything, you'll find that if you practice one really deeply, you'll start to be practicing all of them. There'll be the OI and people who feel very seasoned in the mindfulness trainings here at the fireplace at the consultation time to answer questions that you have or to share their experience. And to know that our tradition encourages what's called double belonging. The Thai says we must really embrace our roots. And for me, I found so much more understanding of my own roots in Judaism from seeing what monasticism and Buddhist practice was like. And now I can happily embrace both, and we've just started a Jubu Sangha. So if you have Christian roots or Muslim roots or Coptic roots, whatever they are, don't feel like this is a negation. See where the two enhance each other and where they're actually very similar. There is a part of the ceremony that says, I take refuge in the Buddha, in the Sangha, in the Dharma. And those are commitments to incorporate our practice into our lives when we have difficulties. We're making that commitment to knowing that we have a potential for awakening. That's the Buddha. It doesn't need to be a guy in a statue that we're bowing down to. It doesn't replace your notion of God or the web of life or whatever you relate to as something transcending your own little self. To take refuge in the Dharma means you're going to follow the practices of understanding and love in whatever forms we can offer them, and that you don't practice alone. You practice with others, both for accompaniment and accountability. And it's really nice to have some container of accountability along with accompaniment. So that's what taking refuge is, and you can choose to do it or not. The ceremony is very open like that.
Jeanette, would you also talk about the blue papers of water and seeds
Oh.
of gratitude?
Oh, good. Is there a scissor out there?
Yes. Yeah, we can put them out there.
Okay.
The basket is right on the ledge here.
Okay. So there are so many wonderful things that happen at a retreat. You know, somebody carries your plate or picks it up to clean it or whatever. And we sometimes don't get an opportunity to express how much gratitude we feel for really little things that kind of make our day. So there's some blue papers that are supposed to be like water, and I thought, oh, we could cut them into drop sizes and write on them what we're grateful for, or it can be very specific to a particular person or not. And maybe we can take that blue tape and just post them up there on the wall. The blue tape is very forgiving. And just allow those drops of gratitude to create a lake over there of our collective experience. Thanks for reminding me, Gina. I think that's it. Next activity is almost instantly gathering in joyous song around the fire pit and doing some walking to work up an appetite for the lunch.